What happens when the man responsible for enforcing the law is accused of breaking it himself? When the face of justice is suddenly the one under scrutiny? That's exactly what exploded inside the Senate chamber, when FBI Director Kash Patel faced a blistering interrogation over one photograph. A single tweet that may have crossed one of the Justice Department's most sacred ethical lines. What seemed like a procedural moment quickly turned into a national reckoning over power, accountability, and the very meaning of justice in America.
Senator Merkley raised on the Constitution because, as you know, in response to a question that the president was asked about whether he had to comply with the Constitution, he said, and I'm quoting, "I don't know." So it is important that we reaffirm everybody's obligation to comply with the Constitution, and I appreciate that was your answer broadly to the question asked by Senator Merkley. But you don't dispute the fact, and I'm quoting here from the Supreme Court opinion in Reno v. Flores, where Justice Scalia wrote, and I quote, "It is well established that the Fifth Amendment entitles aliens to due process of law in deportation proceedings," end of quote. You don't
I don't dispute that.
Okay. Just wanted to make sure, for the record, we understand that because, as you well know, the federal courts have found that there have been gross violations to date of many individuals' due process rights. Let me ask you a question about Judge Dugan, and I'm not going to get into about Judge Dugan, who was arrested, taken out in handcuffs from her courtroom. You agree that as director of the FBI, you should lead by example, right?
Try to.
Okay. Well, there's a confidentiality and media contacts policy within the Department of Justice guidelines that says specifically that DOJ personnel should not voluntarily disclose a photograph of a defendant unless it serves a law enforcement function or unless the photograph is already part of the public record in the case. Clearly, Judge Dugan's photograph was not already part of the public record in the case. So it appears that what you did was a violation of that policy, unless you can express a clear law enforcement purpose for having done that.
The simple law enforcement purpose is to show America that we investigate any individual who commits a crime, especially those in positions of public trust.
But do you agree with the presumption of innocence in the U.S. system?
Absolutely. As a public defender, that's what I fought for years.
Well,
but that's different than this.
But Mr. Director, this is one of the reasons why that guideline is there, so people, especially the director of the FBI, doesn't announce to the country that somebody's already been found criminally liable when they haven't. She hasn't, has she?
But that's not what we said, that she was criminally liable. We said she was arrested and showed it.
Yeah, we know she was arrested, but the issue is the photograph. I'm asking you, going forward, I hope as the leader of the FBI, you will comply with the guidelines of the FBI that everybody else is expected to follow.
I believe I have, and I will going forward.
Well, this seems like a direct violation of this guideline.
I guess we're in disagreement, Senator.
Well, unless you can tell me why that really serves a law enforcement function. So you're going to send out pictures of everybody that's arrested?
Lots of people that are arrested have pictures sent out.
I'm asking you as director of the FBI, is that going to be your policy, just to start sending?
No, we do it on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah. Well, the guidelines make clear that I think any normal interpretation of this suggests it's a violation. Look, we're a budget committee, an appropriations committee. We want to find a way to make sure that we properly resource the men and women who work at the FBI. I think that is a common goal, I hope. And I do just, Mr. Chairman, again, in closing, I understand you want to proceed, just so that we keep things going, but it is kind of hard to proceed without any budget. So.
I don't take you as critiquing or having a hearing.
No,
you're pleased to have a hearing, and I wish we had more to deal with than we do.
I do.
And
It started with what looked like a small decision, posting a photograph of Wisconsin Judge Dugan being led out of her courtroom in handcuffs. But as Senator Chris Van Hollen zeroed in, that small decision started to look like something far bigger. a direct violation of the Department of Justice's own confidentiality and media policies. Under those guidelines, DOJ officials are forbidden from sharing a defendant's photograph unless it serves a clear law enforcement purpose or is already part of the public record. Judge Dugan's wasn't, and that's where the firestorm began. Van Hollen wasted no time setting the tone. His questions cut straight through the usual political niceties. Did the FBI director, America's top law enforcement official, personally authorize the photo? And if so, why? Patel tried to defend himself, saying the image was meant to show that no one is above the law, not even those in positions of power. On the surface, it sounded noble. But beneath that defense lurked a much more uncomfortable truth. Because in the American justice system, being arrested is not the same as being guilty. That's why the presumption of innocence exists. And by broadcasting that photograph, Patel may have blurred that critical line, effectively declaring judgment before a trial had even begun. For Van Hollen, that wasn't just bad optics. It was a fundamental betrayal of the principles Patel was sworn to uphold. As the exchange grew more heated, Patel tried to hold his ground. "We do it on a case-by-case basis," he said, insisting there was no policy violation. But Van Hollen wasn't buying it. He pressed harder, pointing out that the DOJ's own media guidelines leave almost no room for interpretation. They are explicit. Photographs of defendants are not to be released unless there's a legitimate, documented reason tied to law enforcement needs. There was no such justification here, and that's when the real tension in the room became palpable. Was Patel's decision a show of transparency, or a public relations move that put political theatre ahead of justice? That's what Van Hollen wanted to know. The more Patel explained, the deeper the contradictions became. For the senator, this wasn't just about one director's judgment. It was about the credibility of an entire institution. When the leader of the FBI disregards internal rules, it sends a dangerous message that those at the top can bend standards the rest of the country is expected to follow. In that moment, Van Hollen wasn't just grilling Patel. He was testing the integrity of American law enforcement itself. Because once the public begins to doubt whether the system is fair, the damage spreads fast. Trust erodes, confidence cracks, and the idea of equal justice under the law starts to feel like just another slogan. That's why Van Hollen's tone wasn't just accusatory, it was urgent. He wasn't only asking whether Patel violated a policy. He was demanding to know whether the FBI still believes in its own rules. Patel, clearly under pressure, tried to separate the principle from the optics. "Lots of people who are arrested have pictures released," he said, suggesting this wasn't unusual. But that argument didn't land. The senator quickly reminded him that the DOJ's own standards were written precisely to prevent this kind of selective exposure, because every photo carries power. It shapes public perception, influences media coverage, and contaminates a jury pool before a single piece of evidence is heard. And in the age of viral images, perception can convict someone long before a court ever does. That's what makes this case so significant. The director of the FBI isn't just any public official. He's the custodian of national trust. Every statement, every post, every photo carries symbolic weight. And by ignoring that boundary, Patel opened a conversation far larger than he may have intended. Behind the political drama lies a simple but haunting question. Who holds the enforcers accountable? Oversight hearings like this one are supposed to answer that, but even those can feel more like battles for headlines than battles for truth. Yet in this moment, Van Hollen managed to pull the curtain back on something deeper, the fragile balance between transparency and fairness, between showing justice and performing it. Think about it. When the FBI shows the image of a handcuffed judge, the message is powerful. It says, no one is untouchable. But it can also whisper something more dangerous. We decide who to shame. That's the razor-thin line between justice and spectacle. And once it's crossed, the cost isn't just reputational, it's constitutional. For the senator, this wasn't theoretical. He made it personal. As the leader of the FBI, you should lead by example, he reminded Patel, underscoring that leadership means restraint as much as authority. The more Patel tried to justify the decision, the more it highlighted a troubling inconsistency. How could the same FBI that demands discipline from its agents allow its director to operate outside the rules? And while Patel insisted he would go forward in compliance with the policy, the damage was already done. Millions had seen the image, the debate had gone public, and what should have been a question of ethics inside the DOJ had now become a national conversation about justice itself. But Van Hollen wasn't finished. He shifted the focus back to a broader concern: accountability across the board. We want to make sure we properly resource the men and women who work at the FBI, he said. making it clear this wasn't about tearing down the Bureau. It was about preserving its integrity. He emphasized that oversight isn't an attack, it's a safeguard, a way to ensure that the immense power of federal agencies is used responsibly. The irony, of course, is that this entire exchange happened during a budget hearing meant to discuss funding, not ethics. Yet here was the FBI director being called out for potentially violating the very principles that justify the Bureau's funding in the first place. It was a moment that laid bare the uncomfortable truth about power. Even institutions built on justice can falter if their leaders forget that the rules apply to them too. In a democracy, the FBI isn't just a law enforcement agency. It's a symbol. It represents order, fairness, and accountability. The moment its actions appear politically motivated or ethically inconsistent, that symbol starts to fracture. And once trust in that symbol is gone, restoring it is nearly impossible. That's why Van Hollen's confrontation resonated far beyond Washington. It wasn't just about Judge Dugan or a single photograph. It was about how institutions choose to communicate with the public and the fine line between informing and influencing. In an era where every image and statement can go viral in seconds, discretion has become as important as transparency. Patel's defense, that the photo served to demonstrate equality before the law, might appeal to public sentiment, but it raises a dangerous precedent. If every arrest is fair game for exposure, what happens to the principle of impartiality? And who decides which cases deserve that spotlight? That's the dilemma this hearing exposed. The tension between demonstrating justice and protecting it. The senator's persistence forced Patel to confront that contradiction head-on. It wasn't about politics, it was about principle. Because when those at the top blur the lines, it becomes harder for the rest of the system to draw them again. Each exception, made in the name of transparency, chips away at the foundation of fairness that the justice system depends on. At its core, this was a hearing about leadership, not the kind that commands headlines or flexes authority, but the kind that quietly upholds standards when no one's watching. For a director leading one of the most powerful law enforcement agencies on earth, the expectation isn't just competence, it's integrity. And that's exactly what Van Hollen was putting to the test. Patel's supporters might argue he was sending a message that accountability applies to everyone. His critics say he crossed a line that should never be blurred. But both sides can agree on one thing. Moments like this reveal just how fragile public trust really is. Because when faith in the system falters, every photo, every statement, every act of defiance becomes ammunition for division. And maybe that's the real takeaway here. The true measure of justice isn't just how laws are enforced, it's how carefully those enforcing them choose to act. The power to expose wrongdoing must always be balanced with the duty to protect fairness. Once those scales tip too far in either direction, the consequences ripple far beyond a single hearing or a single headline. So, what happens next? If the FBI tightens its communication policies, it could mark a step toward rebuilding trust. But if these incidents keep surfacing, each one will further blur the line between justice and politics. That's why oversight, no matter how uncomfortable, is vital. It's not about punishing officials, it's about reminding them that power must always answer to principle. This story is a reminder that even the smallest act, like sharing a photograph, can ignite a national debate about what justice really means. It's about more than Kash Patel or Judge Dugan. It's about how America defines fairness in an age where every image can become a weapon and every post can shape perception. And for anyone watching, it raises one final question that goes beyond politics or personalities. Should law enforcement ever publicise the moment of someone's downfall before the law itself has spoken? Because if the answer isn't clear now, it soon will be. And how that question is answered may define the public's trust in justice for years to come. So, what do you think? Should the FBI ever release arrest photos of public officials, or should the presumption of innocence always come first? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you believe in accountability, transparency, and real justice, make sure to subscribe, hit that like button, and share this video to keep the conversation going.